I am reading, or I have taken some notes and also reading directly from Paracelsus, An Introduction to Philosophical Medicine in the Era of the Renaissance by Walter Pagel, second edition. And I want to talk about the concept of the Archeus, the Vulcan, and the Iliaster, and its relations to individualization, individuation, and alchemy, and separation and specificity, and all things. And so yeah, I'll just begin. There are elements: earth, air, water, and fire, and there are principles: sulfur, mercury, and Paracelsus adds salt, that are the roots which all bodies are consisting of. All objects consist of these elements and these principles. The principles are not the chemical substances, but are principles of constitution or spiritualization. Sulfur being organization, salt being mass, mercury being activity. And like I said, these principles are the root of everything, including the elements, which Paracelsus ascribes to these units complexities, and in the sense that, for example, the elements is not just water alone, it is the combination of all the elements in which the three others are suppressed and the one is announced, and that is what the element then is. The principles and the elements are all composite bodies, and specifically the elements, however, are also known as matrices or wombs, in which the semina of all objects in nature are hatched, and I will talk about that more as we go on. The elements, being matrices or wombs, generate all objects. So all objects are generated from these wombs in which they dwell, and in the in the womb is where they receive their signature or their ultimate destination. And this idea can be compared to a hermetic vessel. In each of these elements, like I said, one of the elements acquires a power superior to that of the others, while the rest are suppressed. This is the nature of what an element is, and that marks the essential difference from one object to another, assuming that these elements are complex bodies. This idea is inspired by certain ancient concepts of the alternation and combination of elements and the generation and corruption of natural objects. The relationship between the elements, earth, air, wind, fire, and the principles, salt, sulfur, mercury, are a bit contradictory in Paracelsus's writings. They sometimes lack consistency, in the sense that sometimes he will talk about an element as the chemical compound, and then also as a matrix or womb. There is one consistency, however, between all of the objects, and it is the decisive factor that is immanent in that a specific soul-like force is of higher importance than the chemical component of the object, what I'm saying is all objects have a spiritualization, soul force within them. The soul force is an object. The soul force in an object is responsible for the composition of matter. So it's like a precursor to its existence that is obviously still existing within the object, but is the cause, is the source of the object, and is therefore is of more importance than the actual physical object itself. In fact, to be a body at all requires properties such as moisture, dryness, heat, cold, and also structure, solidity, and function. We therefore have three things going on. Archetypes of qualities, spiritual forces which direct bodies to assume these qualities, and the empirical objects in nature. And as I said, the second, the spiritual forces which direct bodies assume, is is the most important. True elements and true principles. Hold on. Being the true elements and principles, whereas empirical. Two being the. Okay, so I guess the second thing that I listed is the truth, is the true part of the element, the true part of the principle, in which empirical objects such as the elements of the ancients and the chemical substances in nature are, as it were, crystallized deposits, the result of an interaction of spiritual forces which cause these forces to become more and more condensed or qualified, specialized, and thus limited in power. So as something becomes more qualified in its form, it is taken away from that true essence of the object and thus limiting its power. So matter is composed of elements and principles and their composition, meaning their continual process of solidification and materialization of the spirit, a process that remains reversible as long as there is even the most minute trace of the spiritual driving force of the elements and principles, is fluid and dynamic rather than a chemical material process. Composition is to be thought of as fluid and spiritualized, and not like as we would think a physical process. Drawing from Hellenistic and medieval alchemy, Paracelsus's doctrine of elements and semina is as follows. The origin of metals is explained in terms of seeds. This is one of the characteristic cases in which alchemy imported biological conceptions into chemistry, an inverted form of biochemistry. This kind of hylozoism was still practiced by Paracelsus, although side by side with it, the modern principle of explaining biological phenomena in chemical terms can be clearly discerned. Generalizing the hylozoistic semen principle of the alchemists, Paracelsus poses invisible semina as the germ cells of every object in nature, opposing these to the visible elements of the ancients. Instead of units of matter, Paracelsus searches for the logoi, which I'm assuming is like logos, or the that which is the precursor to all existence. Instead of units of matter, Paracelsus searches for the logoi in matter and finds them in the semina and the intelligences which they carry, saying, thus our knowledge and understanding acquire a firm basis, as all things have a seed and are encompassed each by its seed. And nature is the maker of figure and form, which is itself the essence, and it is form that indicates essence. So, like I brought up the elements being like the womb in which all things are created, and this idea of semina, which is the basis of form. They sound quite familiar, and I will say later, but I will just say now that the wombs, the elements, are to be seen as semina in the sense of like a egg. It's like a female womb, egg, semina that creates. And the firmament is the masculine, which is necessary along with the matrix. But I will talk about that later. The principles are inherent in the semina and are their main the principles, the salt, mercury, and sulfur, are inherent in the semina and are their main constituents, and one may even say they are the semina themselves. So the elements, the principles, the semina, here are the elements, here are the principles that are the semina, and that is creation. And then the firmament. The true elements and the true principles are forces and archetypes of finest corporality, hidden in the objects of nature and imprinting on them a certain signature. They form units of prime matter, each with a spiritual and a corporeal aspect. This seems to be the overriding idea of Paracelsus' doctrine of matter. This tendency to spiritualize matter, as seen in Paracelsus' work, elevates earthly matter to a more dignified position, and it also bridges the gap between the celestial and terrestrial worlds, which ancient elemental theories had established and kept open. So the idea of the Iliaster, if to Paracelsus, astrum, in a wider sense, means action, virtue, and power of a determined nature, Iliaster does not stand for the matter from which the stars are made and of which every object on earth partakes, but for matter which essentially is and expresses the sum total of specific action, possible and realizable in nature. That is the idea of the Iliaster. I'll talk much more about. The Archeus, derived from Paracelsus, represents individual specificity. It is the material vector of specificity and is significant for a philosophy of the universe which, like his own, cannot conceal its biological hylozoistic basis. According to Paracelsus, God created things in their prime, but not their ultimate matter. He sees the world as a continual process by which objects are perfected, developing from the state of prime matter to that of ultimate matter. The workman in charge of this process of development is the Vulcan. In the earth, the Vulcanus terrae forges grass and plants. The Vulcan is visualized as a virtue or power that is immanent in the matrices or the elements, such as earth, water, fire, or air/heaven. But it cannot work unaided. It needs a reservoir whence it can draw that hidden power that is inherent in material, in matter, in general, primordial matter, and is necessary for the nourishment, growth, and preservation of natural products. The general reservoir for building material is the Iliaster, like I was talking about before, which, as I said, is not a material thing, but like stated, a reservoir in which the Vulcan works inside of. And the Vulcan is the process which develops objects to their perfect form, beginning with prime matter and ending with ultimate matter. So the Iliaster is primordial. It is like a potential man or a potential tree or a potential creature. It is without life, that is to say, it is without individual life. The Vulcan also needs an addition to a reservoir. It can't just work with a reservoir alone. It needs a virtue of separating the individual from the general. A Vulcan has to assemble material of the one kind and thereby impress on the object the stamp of specificity as a member of a species and as an individual. The specificity is the Archeus, which stands for anatomy of life, as it lies in man in each one of his limbs, and it begins at the point where the anatomy of the Iliaster ends, when life infuses the reservoir of potential. So we have the reservoir of the Iliaster, we have the potential direction giving concept of the Vulcan, and we have the separation and individuation concept all working together. However, the Iliaster and the Vulcan work at the same time. So we have together the reservoir of potential and the concept of enduring and developing from primordial matter to ultimate matter. And once that reservoir dies off, there is an Archeus that is a separation principle. And the Vulcan and Archeus thus then work together, and specificity and separation works under the development of potentiality, which is the Vulcan. The Archeus is closely akin to the Vulcan, however. I guess they're both forces of generation in a sense. All things are constituted to have their own Archeus, because all things that are specific, separated bodies, by which they are brought to their highest pitch, be it the Vulcan. The Archeus directs everything into its essential nature, but so does the Vulcan. The Archeus directs everything into its essential nature. The Archeus and the Vulcan hammer out an object, the Archeus and the Vulcan hammer out an object from the diffuse mass of prime matter and guide it on its way to ultimate matter, i.e., to perfect it by the conferring specificity and ever-increasing individuation. So this Archeus principle is also ever-increasing. This individuation principle runs alongside this principle of development from primordial matter to ultimate matter. Like, they're both ever increasing potentials that are reaching their perfected state. It's just different ideas of that. The Archeus is Vulcan operating inside of objects. So perhaps maybe the Vulcan is operating outside, and the Archeus is operating inside. Its function is largely one of separation, the Archeus, a chemical operation performed by nature, as well as by the doctor and the chemist. Yes. For it is by the art of alchemy that things are led to their ultima materia, or perfected state. This is the policy pursued by the Archeus, the internal Vulcan, who knows how to distill and to prepare according to proportion and distribution, just as the art in itself has power to do so by means of sublimation, distilling, reverberating. The art of alchemy, I'm assuming. For all the arts are present in man as well as in alchemy outside. The Archeus in man is identified with the principle residing in the stomach, which separates nourishment for the organs from the waste products of food. So this is like the internal alchemy of man. So where this is happening inside of our own body, this Archeus force is also what's happening in the universe. The Archeus in the stomach enjoys a position of fundamental importance in the biological philosophy of Paracelsus. The Archeus stomach decides, for example, the quality of the urine. Healthy urine should be separated, digested, and expelled in the stomach. I think we've all considered the internal alchemy and self-preservation that happens naturally inside of us, and that is the force of Archeus, according to Paracelsus. The Archeus as the individualizing principle in the elemental matrix. So there's this concept of Archeus in humanity, in us, and then also within these elemental matrices, which all things derive from, as I was saying. So for example, stones are produced in water by the Archeus of water, a process which takes a very long time and can be reproduced in a lab at a faster rate. The terrestrial Archeus digests, promotes putrefaction, generates and augments the seed put into the earth with the assistance of the firmament, so that fruit can grow and serve as food for animals and man. It is through the Archeus of the earth that all 7 metals are born in the mountains, and this is due to the action of the terrestrial Archeus. Paracelsus sees the Archeus as divided into parts, which act on corresponding parts of an object. It also has total power over the object on which it acts. So kind of like how an element is not as simple, or a principle is not a simple body, the Archeus itself is also not a simple body. Paracelsus says that the Anatomia Archei, it's like the Latin form of the Archeus, is the anatomy of life, as it lies in man in each individual limb, like I have said previously. It takes over when the Anatomia Idectari, which is Latin for the Iliaster, ceases, i.e., after the body of the first man has been formed i.e., after the body of the first man has been formed and life is infused. Paracelsus expounds the view that each organ has also a sphere of influence over other organs. This realm is seen as a kind of constellation with the main organ as its center. The heart, for example, governs such a constellation. It has in itself a constellation of its own, in the same way as the inner spirit, Archeus, is to be considered and compared to the external one. Similarly, there is a sidereal power in the womb. If this is disturbed or broken up, it will spread destruction over the whole region of its influence. So this Archeus is divided into many parts, and it can be usurped, in which it will start working in the inverse in a non-healing way. Archei in external objects and inside man. The interaction between the organs of man and such objects of the outside world as drugs or chemicals is an interaction of archei, I suppose that's Archeus plural, and parts of the archei. Each of the four elements is endowed with an Archeus. Each of these archei is divided into parts, and each of the latter corresponds to one organ of the human body. It is from this correspondence that the strengthening and curative action of drugs and chemicals is derived. That which emerges from the heart of the terrestrial Archeus fortifies the heart of man, such as gold, emerald, corals. That which comes from the liver strengthens the liver in a lesser world. There is also a correspondence between the physician himself as acting as an Archeus. The physician who finds the appropriate cure, separating the pure from the impure, or the useful from the waste, just in the same way as does the inner chemist or the Archeus. His action must be based on a deep intuitive understanding rather than an action resulting from mathematical reason. The idea of a physician acting like an Archeus and taking its place where it fails in the patient is indeed a keynote of Paracelsus's reform of medicine. So a physician becoming an Archeus and becoming that healing force, or force that restores order or individuation, or this development into a more perfect form. The Archeus is not only acting in our organs and in the elements, but also in imagination and magia and astral forces. All action is visualized by Paracelsus as flowing from an active imagination, a process not connected with formal logical reasoning, but with the spirit consciousness or subconscious, and in a broad sense embracing all strata of all personality. Thus, the Archeus, the active principle and vector of life, is connected with the mind and is at the same time part of a universal soul, which is but an emanation of the divine mind and intelligence. It is the latter that, although common to the entire universe, creates individual and generic differences. The Archeus is therefore something reserved to the individual and at the same time shared by every object in nature, for the Archeus flows from the power that distributes activity over the universe. It links man with the universe and is more intimate to him than he is to himself. Paracelsus talks of the Olympian spirit, in which proves that imagination can do even more than force a person to certain action. All this has nothing to do with superstitious practices, but lies in the natural course of subtle nature. Imagination and its significance for man in health and disease falls under the magia, which is made accessible by studying astronomical patterns. In these, it is the course of events rather than a static form that matters. The course can be compared to the functional schedule of the organs, i.e., the heart nourishes the body as the sun nourishes the earth. The spleen has a course analogous to that of Saturn. Bile and its physical action corresponds to the directional influence on Mars. The kidneys have a venereal quality and share with Venus exaltations according to the predestination. Venus receives an exalting stimulus from the sun, the kidneys from the seat of sensuality in man. Jupiter acts through benevolence in the same way that the liver softens all violent impulses. These parallels of human imagination and Archeus indicate the work of the invisible archei and therefore the real courses of physiological processes, of customs and expressions and habits and emotions. I want to pause. I said earlier that objects can be changed if they still have a trace of this like elemental force in them. Okay, hold. I'm gonna keep going. Give me a second. Okay, the Iliaster or potential reservoir is a kind of primordial matter, but not matter in an ordinary corporeal sense, as I said before. It is a supreme pattern of matter, a principle that enables coarse, visible matter and all activity of growth and life in it to develop and exist. It is a force that confers activity, life, and growth on the caput mortuum, or earthly matter. It is not an individualizing force, which converts matter into individual object, mineral, vegetable, or animal. And it shouldn't be anywhere here now. If the Archeus is within us, that means the Iliaster is separated off. Which, it makes sense because the definition, or what the Archeus is a separating force. So even in its own existence, fractally, it exists due to separation and separates in its state, in its natural state. Yes. All objects undergo, Iliaster thus designates a concept similar to that of prime matter or immature material, which is worked upon and converted into finished product or ultimate matter. All objects undergo this transmutation from prime through an intermediate towards an ultimate stage, the latter indicating the final fulfillment of destiny or the Aristotelian perfection or entelecheia of an object. This transmutation is brought about by alchemy, the alchemist being nature itself or man helping to promote a natural process to its end. For example, bread in its primal matter or prime matter is like the grain that is supplied by nature. The middle matter or intermediate matter is the oven processing the bread. And the final fulfillment of its destiny or perfect form is, or the prime matter of the bread is, The final form is the man's inner alchemy of turning the bread into flesh and blood, essentially. Or the Vulcan converting that into its final form. In terms of alchemy, the conversion of primary into intermediate and final matter can also be regarded as one of the disease into the decline of death of an object. Prime matter may also be seen as the product of putrefaction, for this causes the seed to germinate in the soil. Intermediate matter can be visualized as a result of the consumption of prime matter, while ultimate matter is powder and earth. Alchemy is the art that separates what is useful from what is not by transforming it into its ultimate matter and essence. And its ultimate matter and essence being putrefaction, which is decay. All objects are striving for their perfect form, and while simultaneously their perfect form is also operating as the seed in which it was germinated from, the putrefied, decayed form in which whence that semina germinated from. So simultaneously, it's as if all things are true while it has realized or perfected its form. It thus becomes nothing at all and is death, but that in itself is regeneration and primordial matter in which things are germinated from. I don't know, it makes me want to cry. The idea of the Cagistrum. Okay, so Paracelsus' belief that separation, as opposed to creation, was the main driving and building force in the world is closely associated with the fall of nature and of man. All individuation and specialization is seen as a breaking away from the original divine unity, simplicity, and homogeneity. So again, this force, this draw of this natural compulsion for individuation is a separation from unity. Like, beings and forces have been successful in an egoistic struggle for independence, working out their own lives in isolation. The whole of nature can be visualized as such a process of splitting up and into individuals, a kind of corruption and putrefaction. It is a result of this process that individual beings, not observable in the original harmonious and homogeneous medium, is seen as spontaneous generation, in which putrefying material gives birth to a large variety of objects that are quite different from the original. It is also seen in diseases. Each disease represents an individual being, to wit, the extrinsic agent that caused disease, a poison, an astral virtue, a command of God, or the product of an abnormal imagination. Thus, disease is an example in which an individual or a pathogenic agent interferes with the harmoniously working organism and causes corruption, separation, and the deposition of impurities. More precisely, an extrinsic agent, such as a poison, interferes with the digestion and metabolism. These normally lead to a full dissolution of food and its conversion into tissues without any remnants but the physiological excreta. In disease, however, abnormal deposits are formed in the organs which appear as pathological changes. Again, it is a case of individual agents being made visible as they build an organism of their own. In this case, the new organism becomes perceptible as a pathological change that leads a parasitic life at the expense of the host. The sum total of all such disruptive processes leading to the splitting of matter into individuals is called the kagistrum. The expression conveys the idea of something bad and degenerative, a fall from Olympic heights down to the valley of miseries, which is nature. An idea already existing in Gnostic doctrines and traditional alchemy. Because of the kagistrum, all created things are mortal and return to nothing. After all, creation is but the process of separation and therefore transitory. Yet there is redemption. It is wrought by Christ's atonement, by rebirth. As his successor and as a receiver of his sacramental body, the Christian will assume his glorified flesh. It is the return of the divine element in man, his sacramental matter or spiritual body, to God, just as the elemental body returns to prime matter of elements. Man, as a microcosm, an epitome of the whole world outside him, will thus, through his own immortality, preserve the whole of the world. It is through man that miraculous work of God is made visible. Generation is a universal process dominating nature, inorganic and organic. The firmament is the father. The elements are the mother, or the matrices or wombs, which contain the semina, which is the principles of female semen comparable to the egg, the male astrum. The female semen is endowed with the power of the sun, which contributes a digestive power that causes development of the potential parts via the Iliaster, via the Vulcan, via the Archeus, in which generation is putrefaction. Birth is death. And it's constantly in that circle. And the endowment of separation, or the Archeus, is due to the fall of man, and the return to it is due to is Christ's atonement. Okay, so this is from this Paracelsus book again. So thank you for listening to this, and thank this book for thank you, Paracelsus.